I didn't disappear all at once. I stayed. And that's what erased me. People talk about leaving as if it's the hardest part. As if walking away is what destroys you. No one talks about what happens when you stay too long, when staying becomes a habit, then a rule, then an identity. I stayed because it was easier than explaining. I stayed because it was familiar. I stayed because nothing was technically wrong. From the outside, my life looked intact. Stable. Predictable. I woke up, went where I was supposed to go, did what was expected of me, and came back home at night. Bills were paid. Conversations were polite. Plans existed. There was no emergency. That's how it happens. I told myself that discomfort was temporary. That every life has dull phases. That not everything needs to feel meaningful all the time. I believed that endurance was a form of strength. So I endured. At first, staying felt responsible. Mature. Like I was choosing continuity over chaos. I avoided dramatic decisions, avoided conflict, avoided risk. I told myself I was protecting what I had built. What I didn't realize was that I was also protecting myself from myself. There was a time when I knew exactly who I was. Not perfectly but clearly enough. I had opinions that felt sharp. Desires that felt dangerous. A sense of direction that didn't need to be explained. Over time, that clarity softened. I adjusted my reactions to keep things smooth. I edited my words to avoid tension. I learned which parts of myself were inconvenient and quietly put them away. It didn't feel like betrayal. It felt like adaptation. People praised me for it. They said I was easy to be around. Reliable. Calm. Someone who didn't make things complicated. I accepted the compliments because they gave my silence a positive meaning. Inside, something was thinning. I didn't feel sad. That's what fooled me. Sadness would have demanded attention. Anger would have forced action. What I felt instead was neutrality. A flatness that didn't hurt enough to alarm me. Days started blending together. Not because they were busy, but because they were empty of distinction. Weeks passed without leaving memories behind. When I tried to recall specific moments, they slipped away like water. Time wasn't moving fast. It was passing unnoticed. I noticed it in conversations. How often I responded automatically. How rarely I said what I actually thought. I wasn't lying, I was filtering. Constantly. Filtering myself until there was less and less to filter. At night, when everything was quiet, I felt a strange pressure in my chest. Not anxiety. Not grief. Just a dull awareness that something essential was missing. I would lie there and ask myself when I had last felt fully present in my own life. The answer was always uncomfortable. I realized that staying had become my default response to everything. Stay in conversations that felt empty. Stay in routines that numbed me. Stay in a version of myself that didn't ask for much. Staying required no courage. Only patience. And patience, unchecked, turns into surrender. The most frightening realization came slowly. No one was holding me there. There were no visible chains. No single decision trapping me. I wasn't stuck because I couldn't leave. I was staying because leaving would require me to admit how long I had already stayed. Every year I remained made the cost of leaving feel higher. More explanations. More justifications. More grief for lost time. So I told myself it was too late, even when it wasn't. I stayed until staying felt normal. I stayed until leaving felt impossible. And somewhere along the way, without ceremony or warning, I stopped recognizing myself. Not in a dramatic way, just enough to feel unsettled when I caught my reflection in a mirror. The face looking back at me wasn't unhappy. It was unfamiliar. That was when it finally occurred to me, I hadn't lost myself because I made a wrong choice. I lost myself because I kept choosing not to choose. Because staying felt safer than discovering who I might become if I left. And because no one tells you that forgetting yourself doesn't feel like pain at first. It feels like relief. After that realization, the familiar began to feel unstable, not because anything changed, but because I could finally see it. The routines I once leaned on now felt like scaffolding I had mistaken for a home. They held everything up, but they weren't meant to be lived inside forever. I started noticing how often I chose silence over honesty. Not out of fear of conflict, but out of habit. I had become skilled at reading the room, adjusting my tone, smoothing my edges. I could sense the moment when my real thoughts would complicate things, and I swallowed them automatically. People called that maturity. I called it survival. My body began reacting in ways I could no longer explain away. Sleep stopped restoring me. I woke up already tired, as if I had spent the night bracing for a life I didn't want to enter. My chest felt tight during ordinary moments while driving familiar roads, answering familiar questions, repeating familiar stories. Sometimes my heart would race without warning. I would pause, breathe slowly, tell myself nothing was wrong. Everyone feels this sometimes. Everyone gets tired. But this wasn't tiredness. It was resistance. I realized how much effort went into staying. Staying calm. Staying agreeable. Staying where I was supposed to be. Leaving might have required one difficult decision. Staying required thousands of small ones, made daily, silently. Each one cost me something. I began to grieve without knowing exactly what I was grieving. It wasn't a specific dream or opportunity. It was identity. The slow loss of a self that once had weight and direction. The version of me who reacted strongly, wanted deeply, believed they had a say. Late at night, I replayed old memories not to relieve them, but to interrogate them. I searched for the moment where I could have spoken up, walked away, chosen differently. There was no single moment to blame. Just a long sequence of almosts. I almost said no. I almost left. I almost trusted myself. The moral dilemma that emerged was quiet but brutal. If I stayed exactly as I was, nothing catastrophic would happen. That was the promise. I would remain functional, dependable, intact. I would continue fulfilling expectations. I would age inside a life that didn't require my presence. If I tried to reclaim myself, everything would become uncertain. I would confuse people. Disrupt routines. Risk discovering that I had waited too long, that the self I wanted to return to no longer existed. That possibility terrified me. Some nights, the idea of disappearing returned. Not dying, disappearing. Leaving without explanations. Removing myself from the version of my life that felt like a performance I had been playing for years. Starting somewhere I wasn't already defined. The idea scared me. It also brought relief. That contradiction was impossible to ignore. I tried to talk myself out of it. I listed reasons to stay. Responsibility. Gratitude. Stability. I had rehearsed those arguments for years, and they used to work. Now they felt thin. Then came a moment so ordinary it almost slipped past me. Someone asked me a simple question, without judgment or drama. Are you okay like this? I opened my mouth to answer automatically. To reassure. To minimize. To say something polite and final. Instead, I hesitated. The silence felt heavier than any answer. In that pause, I understood something I had been avoiding. I wasn't choosing this life anymore. I was maintaining it. Maintenance doesn't ask who you are. It only asks that you keep things from falling apart. And I had become very good at that. Too good. That night, I didn't sleep. Not because I was anxious, but because something in me refused to return to numbness. I realized that my life wasn't broken. It was unfinished. And I was the only one who could decide whether it would stay that way. For the first time, staying felt like an active choice instead of a default. And once a choice becomes visible, it becomes heavy. It demands to be owned. I knew the next step wouldn't be clean or heroic. It would cost me comfort, approval, certainty. It might even cost me relationships I had built my life around. But I also knew this: if I stayed exactly where I was, the cost would be higher, just quieter. I had stayed until I forgot who I was. The question wasn't whether I could find myself again. The question was whether I was willing to risk everything familiar to try. I didn't suddenly remember who I was. There was no moment where everything snapped back into place, no rush of certainty or clarity that told me exactly what to do next. What happened was quieter. I stopped pretending that staying was neutral. Once I understood that every day I remained was a choice, staying became unbearable, not because my life was painful, but because it required my absence to function smoothly. It asked me to be smaller, quieter, easier, and I had been agreeing for years. So I began with refusal. I didn't burn bridges. I didn't announce a transformation. I simply stopped participating in my own disappearance. I let conversations end instead of extending them out of politeness. I allowed silence where I would normally fill space. I stopped explaining myself in advance, as if my existence needed permission. These changes were subtle. They were also disruptive. People noticed the gaps before they noticed the reasons. They said I seemed distant, different, less available. Some were concerned. Some were offended. A few tried to pull me back gently, reminding me how long I had been this way, how strange it was to question things now. They weren't wrong. Questioning things now meant confronting how long I had avoided doing it. It meant acknowledging years spent choosing comfort over truth, stability over self-respect. That acknowledgement hurt more than any single loss ever could. Fear reacted immediately. It reminded me how late I was. How fragile everything would become if I kept moving in this direction. It told me I would fail publicly, that I would regret disrupting a life that worked, that whatever I tried next would only highlight how much time I had already lost. There were nights when that fear almost convinced me to stop. To return. To apologize to the version of myself that knew how to endure quietly. Nights when loneliness felt like punishment and doubt felt sharp and convincing. But even in those moments, something was different. I could feel myself. The pain I felt wasn't distant anymore. It wasn't muted. It was sharp, immediate, alive. And that hurt, but it also meant I was present. I wasn't fading quietly anymore. I was reacting, resisting, choosing. Trying to reclaim myself didn't feel empowering. It felt empty. Like standing in a room after everything familiar has been removed, unsure where anything belongs. Without the structure of routine and expectation guiding me, I had to face myself directly, my fear, my hesitation, my long neglected instincts. I was clumsy. I hesitated. I made decisions without guarantees and lived with the discomfort of not knowing whether they were right. I learned that presence doesn't come with confidence, it comes with attention. Slowly, time began to change. Days stopped collapsing into each other. Moments stayed with me. Even ordinary experiences carried weight, not because they were dramatic, but because I was actually there for them. I wasn't managing my life anymore. I was inhabiting it. I grieved what I had lost. That grief didn't disappear when I started moving. It still visits me sometimes, quietly. I mourn the years spent adapting instead of choosing, surviving instead of living. But I no longer let that grief decide my future. I learned something I wish I had understood earlier: regret doesn't come from choosing the wrong path. It comes from abandoning yourself slowly enough that you don't notice until you're gone. From letting habit replace intention and endurance replace truth. Reclaiming myself didn't make my life easy. It didn't make it impressive or clean. Some relationships didn't survive the change. Some versions of my future closed permanently. I carry those losses with me. But I also carry something I didn't have before. Ownership. Ownership of my fear. Ownership of my uncertainty. Ownership of the life I am still learning how to live. I no longer confuse endurance with virtue. I no longer confuse familiarity with safety. And I no longer confuse disappearing quietly with being at peace. If you're listening to this and something inside you feels heavy, restless, uncomfortably awake, I want to tell you to leave your life or erase everything you've built. Not every situation requires escape. But every situation requires honesty. Ask yourself gently, without excuses, whether you are still choosing your life, or merely maintaining it. Whether the calm you feel is peace, or just the absence of resistance. Because one day, quietly, without warning, you may realize that nothing is broken, and you are no longer there. I stayed until I forgot who I was. Remembering didn't happen all at once. It happened the moment I stopped agreeing to disappear. And choosing yourself even late, even afraid, even without a map, is not a dramatic ending. It's the first honest beginning.